I don't think I'll be able to get a John Byrne commission of any of my characters after this video. Now available in paperback at e-readers, Isis, Dark Incubus. The goddess next door gets enthralled in a romantic entanglement with an evil incubus in this all-new Isis series adventure. Get your copy of Isis, Dark Incubus in paperback and e-readers today. Better get the coleslaw, y'all, cause we're having us a barbecue. Did legendary comic book artist John Byrne indirectly cause the collapse of the comic book industry? Now, when I take a critical look at the timeline of events that transpired during 1987, I can see where some alleged actions that John Byrne participated in could have possibly led to indirectly to the complete collapse of the comic book industry in the 1990s. Now, back in the 1990s, John Byrne had serious issues with Marvel Comics editor Jim Shooter and basically clashed with Jim Shooter over multiple issues as related to his work at Marvel Comics. And as John Byrne had his issues with Jim Shooter, he allegedly had a party at his home which several comic artists allegedly attended, where he held up a piñata which was taped with a lot of New Universe comics from Jim Shooter's failed line of Marvel Comics, and a picture of him on the head of the piñata, and burned Jim Shooter's image in effigy, and allegedly videotaped or photographed this event, and then sent this whole tape over to the then executives over at Marvel Comics, and this led to Jim Shooter eventually being terminated from Marvel Comics in 1987. And I have to wonder if this event basically was the one catalyst that led to the overall decline of Marvel Comics and the comic book industry, because Jim Shooter, as the editor-in-chief at Marvel, was the architect that led to the complete rebuilding of the brand, rebuilding the brand by establishing an infrastructure that made it run like a publishing business. And it was this whole standard that he set that basically led to the resurgence of Marvel as a brand and led to the resurgence of sales. Unfortunately, many artists like John Byrne did not like the way Jim Shooter approached business and did not like several of the standards that he established, such as establishing deadlines for work to be turned in and establishing that he would have the final say as related to what would go to print. And as a result of these standards, John Byrne basically clashed with Jim Shooter, the editor-in-chief at Marvel, and as he clashed with Jim Shooter at Marvel, he basically again led to this alleged incident that led to Jim Shooter getting fired, but this whole incident could have had a ripple effect on the overall comic book industry. Now, the ripple effect that I am speculating that possibly could have happened to the comic book industry in 1987 could be that without that leader in charge at Marvel to establish standards, what could have happened is that Marvel Comics in and of itself started on a road to decline because it did not have that strong leader to maintain the entire editorial department over at Marvel Comics. And without that leader to be able to set a course for Marvel as a publishing house, standards went into a major state of decline in the 1990s, and it went into this major state of decline in the 1990s after Tom DeFalco wound up taking over, and then after Tom DeFalco took over in 1994, the entire editorial department began to change, and this is where we got the new Extreme Marvel, where we had editorial departments, and these editorial departments basically were running different books like they called Marvel Heroes, the X books, the Hulk, and Spider-Man. And all of this basically editorial lack of direction, and lack of focus led to the decline of Marvel, and this could have basically been the further got worse when Marvel went out here and decided to get into distribution without a solid leader, and they bought Heroes World. And as they bought Heroes World, they basically tried to get into distribution. However, their products were not of high quality, and as they weren't of high quality, Marvel went on the road to bankruptcy. And as I connect the dots and go from 1995 all the way back to 1987, I can basically see where the dominoes started falling, and the dominoes, as I see it, as related to the decline of Marvel, didn't start with Heroes World, but possibly could have started with John Byrne undermining the authority of Jim Shooter as the editor-in-chief at Marvel, and him undermining the leadership and authority of Jim Shooter could have been the catalyst that was the first domino that led to Marvel falling, and Marvel eventually falling into bankruptcy in 1995. Now, when it comes to businesses as related to their decline does not really start in the later stages. No, it's usually an inciting incident that happens at the peak of the business. And I believe what happened in 1987 as Marvel was rising as a company, basically they didn't see where the issue they were having was with John Byrne undermining the leadership, because without that strong leader to set a course for a publishing company, that company cannot really maintain its standards, and if it can't maintain its standards, there's no way to go out and expand the business. And the termination of Jim Shooter, as I see it, basically was the first domino that wound up falling, and a lot of people couldn't see how that domino would have an effect, because Marvel was doing well from 1987 and did even better in 1988, 1989, and 1990, and in 1990 they had started growing into their peak as related to popularity, and they thought they could go out here and navigate a course under the leadership of Tom DeFalco, but sadly they didn't have that vision that Jim Shooter had, and since they didn't have that vision, they couldn't see where they were going as they were peaking with success with Todd McFarlane's Spider-Man #1, Jim Lee's X-Men #1, and the Infinity Gauntlet. They couldn't see where they were going from 1990 to 1991, and they couldn't really set a course for the 90s as related to quality storytelling, because as we saw without Jim Shooter in charge, what happened over at Marvel was they were heavily focused on a lot of gimmicks and variant covers. Moreover, they were not able to go out here and be able to recruit top talent after Jim Lee, Rob Liefeld, and Todd McFarlane wound up leaving, and again, couldn't do this because they didn't have a visionary editor-in-chief to be able to maintain the house, something that I believe John Byrne couldn't understand because he was an artist and not a publisher. And as a publisher myself, I believe that he couldn't understand one thing that I understood as a publisher, because in addition to him having issues with Jim Shooter as related to deadlines and having the final say, he often talked about how Jim Shooter basically could not stop fixing things, and that really shows me how John Byrne really didn't understand the publishing business. He didn't understand that in the publishing business, what he called fixing things was actually maintaining the business, and any publisher understands that you have to keep maintaining the business, because the books that sold back in 1981 are not the books that are going to sell in 1991. So you're not fixing the business. No, you're constantly changing the business, because the business basically is one where the audience is constantly changing. And as the audience constantly changes, you have to go out here and adapt so that you can continue making products that appeal to the newer readers. And this is something that John Byrne didn't understand, about the publishing business, he didn't understand that in the publishing business, things are constantly changing, and what appeals to the audience of Gen Xers that basically led to the resurgence of comics wasn't going to appeal to the millennial generation who basically were looking at a completely different world, nor was it going to appeal to the generation Z who comes right after them and the other generations that came after them. And this is why you're always constantly what he called fixing things, but what you're doing is constantly looking to change things, to maintain things, to make the product appealing to new customers. He didn't understand this whole point because sadly, with John Byrne, yes, he's one of the greatest artists as related to comics, but he knows absolutely nothing about the publishing business. And since he knows absolutely nothing about the publishing business, he made a decision that basically led, I believe, indirectly to the complete collapse of the comic book industry, because with the firing of Jim Shooter, basically Marvel didn't have that leader, did not have that leader to basically set a course for the company and set a direction for the company. And that was disastrous as related to the overall Big Two, because the Big Two, Marvel and DC, are the companies that basically keep most of the comics shops in business. And if their products aren't selling, then most comic shops are not able to stay operational. So that's where I'm taking a critical look at John Byrne and seeing how his whole decision to go out here and mock Jim Shooter led to, ironically, him basically showing his just actions that did damage to the overall comic book industry. And this decision to undermine Marvel's editorial did catastrophic damage to Marvel as a business, did catastrophic damage to Marvel as a business, and led to a series of people who were okay editors, but just did not have that vision to go out here and be able to set a course for the business to make it all about what the main thing that you have to do as a publisher is focus on generating sales. Because what a publisher has to do is they have to have a strong editor-in-chief in charge, because they have to focus on not only going out here and having the establishing standards like deadlines to get material in on time so that you can have the material on hand so that other people in the process, such as people like letterers, colorists, and other people, can look at this art and work on this art to make sure that the book comes out on time. But you also need to have an editor with the final say, because the editor-in-chief is the one who basically has to represent the business to, one, the readers, who are wanting him to be objective eyes and ears to make sure that the books meet the standards that fit the character, and two, you need the editor-in-chief to have the final say, because they have to answer to executives like the CEO, like members of the board, and they also have to answer to all of the different groups that are out here, like advertisers who basically, again, want to see certain images of these characters to feel comfortable about those products being out there. Again, John Byrne didn't understand the intricacies of the publishing business when he went out here and burned Jim Shooter's image in effigy, and did this, as one of my Facebook friends says, as related to jealousy. And again, with his jealousy and his envy, basically burned the entire comic book industry, which never really recovered. Yes, you had a peak of popularity in the 1990s, but it wasn't able to maintain a course as related to that success after the 1990s. And the contempt shown to Jim Shooter, I believe, did even further damage as he was working at Valiant, which eventually was sold, ironically, to a video game company, Acclaim, which basically did damage to the overall Valiant brand. And when Shooter tried to start his own company, Defiant, Marvel basically came after him and sued him. And that, I believe, basically started, again, Marvel's road to further decline, and the industry never really recovered from that slump. And when I connect the dots to all the events, it just shows me how one beta male can just do damage to an entire business. It shows me how one beta male caught up in his feelings about things that he was offended by as related to business, which are standard practices at any other company. I mean, if you go to any other trade publishing house, any writer out here knows they don't have the final say over a book after it is sold. After the writer sells the book, it's the publisher who can come in and basically do whatever they please to that book. Same thing with newspaper articles. Once the article is now property of the newspaper, they can do whatever they please with that article. They have the final say if it gets run or not. And the same thing goes on at every magazine like Vogue, Cosmopolitan, and any other magazine like Martha Stewart or Oprah Winfrey or even Playboy magazine. It is the editor-in-chief that has the final say on what gets published in the pages of that book. And when I listen to guys like John Byrne, they show me they don't understand how the business works as related to publishing. I mean, when it comes to publishing, again, nobody has no writer or artist has a final say. No, you get commissioned to do freelance work. You get commissioned to do the work, and if the work meets the standards of the editor and the standards of the editor-in-chief, you basically get a check cut, and after you get your check cut and you sign the release, you just get paid and you just keep it pushing. And you keep it pushing because once whatever gets published is going to lead to you getting more gigs, and what will even further lead to you getting more gigs is you being a professional and saying, look, okay, I may have submitted the story, they may have made some tweaks, and those tweaks were their right because it's their property. Once I go out here and I sign the release, it's now officially their property, and it's their property because they basically are the ones who own the property, and as related to possibly as cases of material. So that's what happens in trade publishing. Once it's sold, it's no longer yours. But John Byrne didn't understand this whole concept, and what's really funny is that this dude, again, is considered to be one of the greatest artists of all time, but sadly didn't understand the art of business, didn't understand the art of the publishing business, and his decision to again mock Jim Shooter has sadly turned the comic book industry into a complete mockery of itself almost 30 years later. And almost 30 years later, we have a comic book industry where sadly more people are saying that they wish they had the standards of Jim Shooter, because when we look at editorial right now over at Marvel and DC, it's a pale shadow of itself, where it's basically almost worse than the 1970s before Shooter took over. It's almost worse than the 70s because now there are absolutely no standards for art. There are no standards for storytelling, and editorial is so weak that they just publish basically anything. I mean, some of the art in these comics is absolute hot garbage at this point, and some of the writing is just absolutely terrible. And sadly, it could be indirectly a result of John Byrne's decision in 1987 to get Jim Shooter fired. That could be the reason why we have terrible comics today, because if we look at all the dominoes that fell from the firing of Jim Shooter in 1987, it leads to Tom DeFalco being in charge and us getting the gimmick era of Marvel that basically I doubt Jim Shooter would have signed off on, because he would have insisted that standards be maintained and basically make sure that these characters maintain their integrity. And a lot of that integrity was compromised over the course of the 90s with horrible gimmick event stories that basically, like I Married a Skrull, like The Crossing, and Captain America in an Exosuit, and other horrible storylines I mean, and the Clone Saga, all these storylines did damage to these characters as related to things, and eventually we got Onslaught that was supposed to try to fix this mess, but it didn't fix it. We got Heroes Reborn, which was trying to fix it. Then we got a reboot and that basically tried to get things right, but after Joe Quesada took over in 2000, after Kurt Busiek wound up leaving, this is where Marvel went into just a major state of decline, where we got these darker stories from guys like Mark Millar. And if we follow the timeline, we can see the overall complete decline of Marvel as related to things. And when I look at it, the inciting incident for the decline of Marvel is that episode that people say happened with John Byrne, where he allegedly, again, burned Jim Shooter in effigy and basically set the entire comics industry on fire. And again, these things happen over time. This is me, again, speculating as related to the timeline of events. And again, I can look at this timeline and clearly see where one beta male man in crisis basically put an entire industry in crisis. He put an entire industry in crisis because he didn't understand how the publishing business worked. And basically because he didn't understand why the publishing business worked, he basically led to the end of comics as a medium here in America, and led to comics basically going from a medium that was on its road to a resurgence to one that basically is on its way out and being beaten by manga at this point. Now, my first full comic, John Haynes at Death's Door, is available on Lulu.com right now, and you can pick up a paperback copy for the same price as it was on the 2022 Kickstarter. And you can pick up my first digital comic, Esteem No Good Deed, on Kindle for 99 cents, and you can get the paper version of that comic in the Esteem series book, Esteem Blast from the Past, which is available on Amazon.com, along with the other SJS Direct Universe books, such as the ISIS series, such as the Esteem series, the John Haynes series, books in the Spinsterella trilogy, Spellbound, the legendary Mad Matilda and Spinsterella, and the upcoming Spinsterella Goth Girl Summer, and other books like my vampire novel, Eternal Night. You can find all those books on Amazon.com in paperback and Kindle format. You can also find them at other online booksellers like Draft the Digital, Google Play, Barnes & Noble, and big box retailers like Walmart and Target. That's all I have to say for this video. You can comment, rate, and subscribe. Now available on Lulu, John Haynes at Death's Door. The man who rules the world takes on the Greek god of death in this action-packed, all-new John Haynes comic book. Get your copy of the first John Haynes comic at Lulu.com today. Now available in paperback and e-readers, Isis, Amari's Revenge. The goddess next door is confronted by a Nubian queen out for revenge at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in this inaugural Isis series adventure. Get your copy of Isis, Amari's Revenge in paperback and e-readers at Amazon.com and online booksellers everywhere. Support Black-owned and Black-operated digital broadcast media. www.niceradionetwork.com. Nice Radio Network, broadcasting 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.